The Labour proposal's getting some headlines this morning, despite the fact that really it's essentially a continuation of what was already underway with a little bit more heft. I like the word re-nationalise, and I like the timescale they've put in place. They will re-nationalise most passenger rail services within 5 years. So as the contracts expire, so they will bring passenger services back into public control. And then if you travel by railway, you'll be pleased to hear about automatic refunds for train delays and improved internet connections. That seems to me to be a really silly missed opportunity for anyone who's been in power for, say, 14 years, because internet connections on a train are a game changer. I want to look more at what's gone so wrong, because there's a weird pendulum here, isn't there? You know, we use the pendulum paradigm when we're talking about change, whether it's political or social change. The idea that you have about a year where things are quite well balanced. So they go from being far too far in one direction, and then the pendulum starts swinging back. And then you have this weird period of time where things are okay, and then the pendulum starts swinging that way again. So nationalisation obviously saw the pendulum of British Railways go too far in that direction. They became sclerotic. They became hidebound by, I think industrial action was probably quite a big part of it. But also, I always think of Carry On at Your Convenience, the Carry On film. I acknowledge that my cultural references so far on the programme have been a little bit dated, all right? I don't think that the Carry On films are confined to people who were around when they were made. The younger generation surely have enjoyed a little bit of Kenneth Williams or Barbara Windsor in their time. But Carry On at Your Convenience was a pastiche, really, of industrial relations, in which I think Sid James played the shop steward. And they would go out on strike at the drop of a hat. And it was funny at the time because it was redolent of reality. It reminded people of reality. So at one point, I think the people in the toilet factory who were in charge of polishing flushes were asked to also polish toilet seats. I've made that up, but the point stands. And therefore, they all went out on strike because you couldn't ask the flush polishers to also buff a toilet seat. If you did that, then everyone would go out on strike until the union had renegotiated terms and conditions. Now, I am a big fan of trade unions. I think, again, pendulum comes into play. Trade unions have too much power. They can bring a country to a standstill in pursuit, I would argue, in Arthur Scargill's case, of quite a vain political project. And then when they don't have enough power, you end up with Rupert Murdoch and Wapping and people being sacked left, right and centre without really having any recourse to justice. So the pendulum of the railways, I don't know when it hit the sweet spot. I don't know when the railways were good, but I do remember growing up. So now you'd be going back 30 years or so when I used them all the time. Never ever really setting off on a railway journey, contemplating the possibility of it not going swimmingly. You'd leave your home, you'd get to Kidderminster station, you'd get into Euston pretty much exactly when you expected to get into Euston. These are the days before mobile phones. So if you were delayed or if someone was meeting you or something like that, it was very difficult to get hold of them to tell them that you weren't going to be there, which means it never happened. Because if it did, you'd remember the stress of how the heck am I going to tell my mum that I've missed my train? Because it was stressful and you couldn't make phone calls. Could you make phone calls from trains? I don't think you could make phone calls from trains. You'd need a very long wire, wouldn't you, to make sorry. What has happened to our railways? The appalling state of the system is, I think, inarguable. The idea that you set off on a railway journey confident that it will go according to the timetable, that withered on the vine some time ago. I'm interested in, that was it, it was B-days. They wanted to start making B-days, which in many ways is going to be the same sort of China work as a toilet, isn't it? But the union were outraged at the prospect of making B-days. And British Rail was a byword for that kind of union excess. And that's why the privatisation project was both popular and enacted. British Rail had been essentially brought to its knees by various factors, of which I think trade union excess was probably one. But the Kenneth Cope was the shop steward. I've got to stop doing this because then you just send me texts correcting my memories of 1970s comedy films. Kenneth Cope was the shop steward and Sid James was the foreman. You're quite right, of course, but that's not really important in the context of a conversation that we're hoping to have about the railways. What has happened to them? Is it lazy to suggest that this is, with the possible exception of the water companies, this is the best available example of what happens when the Tories get their hands on the national infrastructure? When the Tories get to sell what really belongs to all of us to their mates. And I grant you, the money that comes into the public purse, so it is, at least in theory, spent on all of us. But you look at what's happened to the water companies, the amount of money that has been taken out of those companies, while it is dwarfed only by the amount of sewage that has been pumped into our waterways. There's another story in the news today about how reluctant we all are to go swimming in the sea. Think about how sad that is. Only 14% of people are likely to swim in Britain's seas and rivers this summer because of raw sewage. Raw sewage. So there's a wonderful example of what happens when the Tories flog off stuff that belongs to all of us and instead turn it into cash cows to be milked by their plutocrat mates, or indeed sometimes by foreign government-owned utility companies. Is the railway the nearest comparison to that, the second best example? Because when I say simplistic or undergraduate, I'd quite like it to be more complicated, because otherwise it makes us look like patsies, doesn't it? It makes us look like a nation of lemmings. What's that you say? You're selling off our railways, and then someone over there, probably Tony Benn, says, oh no, you don't want to do that. Give it 20 years and there'll be an absolute disaster, and the only people who've done well out of it will be the people who bought the shares, and they'll have disappeared over the horizon to count all their money, and the rest of us will be left trying to get from A to B by donkey. And then we go, oh, it's 20 years later and he was right. That's what I mean by simplistic. I'd like it to be a little bit more complicated than that. But I'm not sure it is. One of the oddest things that's happened to me as I've got older, you're supposed to become more right-wing as you get older, aren't you? And I am now in the kind of tax bracket where every Tory budget makes me better off. It's, on one level it's great, although I will continue to vote against them. The weirdest thing is that you kind of wonder whether things are actually as clear and as simple as you used to think they were when you were very young. Why are the railways in such a mess? Because there is a brand of conservative politics that looks at everything as a potential profit pipeline. And if we let them turn anything into a potential profit pipeline, they will suck the profits out of it until the pipeline itself is in jeopardy or broken. Is it that simple? Is that what's happened? These companies have just sucked all of the profits through these pipes. Costs about 50 quid more to get to New York and back now, if you shop around for the flights, than it does to go to Newcastle and back in first class on a British train. Just riddle me that. New York and back on an aeroplane versus Newcastle and back on a train. So what has happened? And feel free to tell me that it is as simple as you suggest. We are a country that's been gaslit and groomed by right-wing media owners and right-wing politicians into literally handing over our sovereignty, you want to call it that? Handing over our national infrastructure, handing over our public utilities to the highest bidders, who then just suck the marrow out of the bones of our country until they're fat on it and there's nothing left for the rest of us to enjoy.